The morning sun peeked through the slightly dusty windows of Joey's diner, casting warm patches of light across the checkered floor. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as Min worked her way through the breakfast rush, her feet moving to a rhythm only she could hear. Her black apron had a small coffee stain from yesterday's shift, and her notepad was already half full with breakfast orders. Between serving plates of steaming pancakes and refilling endless coffee cups, Min's eyes kept drifting to the old upright piano tucked away in the corner. It sat there like a forgotten friend, its wooden surface carrying years of water rings from carelessly placed coffee cups and memories of better days. The morning regulars probably didn't know that those same hands that carried their plates had once danced across the keys at one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. 5 years ago, Min's life had been completely different. She'd walked the halls of her music conservatory with dreams as big as the sky, practicing until her fingers ached and her teachers had to remind her that even practice rooms closed for the night. But life had other plans. When her dad got sick and the medical bills started piling up, Min had to make a choice. Her little brother was still in high school, and someone had to keep the family afloat. Now, at 26, she moved through the diner with the same grace she once showed on stage. "Order up," called Ray from the kitchen, his voice mixing with the clinking of plates and morning chatter. Min balanced 3 plates along her arm with practiced precision, a skill quite different from playing Chopin, but one she'd mastered nonetheless. "More coffee, hun?" she asked an elderly gentleman absorbed in his morning paper. He nodded without looking up, and she poured with one hand while adjusting her serving tray with the other. In moments like these, muscle memory took over, just like it used to when she performed. Her fingers would sometimes tap out piano pieces on the serving tray as she walked, feeling the ghost of melodies that used to flow through them. The breakfast crowd buzzed with conversation. Business people rushing to meetings, retired couples sharing quiet moments over toast and eggs, college students fighting hangovers with strong coffee and greasy food. Min knew all their usual orders by heart, just like she once knew her favorite sonas. During a rare quiet moment, she found herself standing near the piano. Her hand reached out, almost of its own accord, and brushed against the closed lid. A thin layer of dust came away on her fingertips. The last time she played was 2 weeks ago, after closing time, when the diner was empty except for Ray cleaning up in the kitchen. She'd played softly, not wanting to disturb him, but he'd stuck his head out anyway and smiled that kind smile of his. The chime of the door snapped her back to reality as a new customer walked in. Min quickly wiped her hands on her apron and reached for her notepad. As she walked toward the new table, she hummed quietly to herself, a habit she'd never quite broken. It was a piece she used to play, back when her biggest worry was perfecting her technique for the next recital. A small part of her still believed that someday, somehow, she'd find her way back to music. Not in the way she'd originally planned, perhaps, but in a way that could blend with the life she now lived. For now, though, there were orders to take, coffee to pour, and customers to serve. She straightened her shoulders and put on her warmest smile, ready to face another day at Joey's diner, where every shift was its own kind of performance. The Tuesday morning rush had just died down when the bell above the diner door chimed. Min looked up to see Mr. Park taking his usual spot in booth 7. He was as predictable as the sunrise, every Tuesday and Thursday at 10:30 a.m., dressed in clean-pressed business clothes that stood out among the diner's usual crowd. She'd nicknamed him Blueberry Man in her head long before learning his actual name, thanks to his unwavering order of blueberry pancakes and black coffee. Today, his silver-streaked hair was slightly windblown, and his laptop bag looked heavier than usual. Without waiting for him to ask, Min grabbed the coffee pot and headed over. "The usual?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded with that quiet smile of his, the one that always reached his eyes. What Min didn't know was that Mr. Park had built his career discovering hidden talents in unexpected places. His production company had launched several successful musicians' careers, though you'd never guess it from his humble demeanor. He came to Joey's Diner precisely because it wasn't the kind of place people went looking for him. As Min poured his coffee, she absent-mindedly hummed a piece she'd been practicing in her head during her morning bus ride. It was Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, though she doubted anyone would recognize it through her quiet humming. Mr. Park's hand paused halfway to his coffee cup, his expression changing almost imperceptibly. "That's Beethoven, isn't it?" he asked, surprising her so much she almost overfilled his cup. Min felt her cheeks warm. "Oh, yes, sorry about that. Sometimes I don't realize I'm doing it." "Don't apologize," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "You have perfect pitch, and unless I'm mistaken, your fingers were playing along on your notepad." She glanced down at her hand, embarrassed to realize she had indeed been fingering the notes on her order pad. It was an old habit from her conservatory days, practicing pieces mentally during quiet moments, her fingers moving through the motions even without a piano beneath them. "I used to play," she admitted, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "A long time ago." "Used to?" Mr. Park raised an eyebrow. He'd seen her stealing glances at the old piano in the corner, seen how she moved with a dancer's grace between tables, how her hands worked with precise, measured movements that spoke of years of training. Before he could say more, the kitchen bell rang. "Order up," Ray called from the kitchen. Min gave Mr. Park an apologetic smile and hurried off to fetch someone's lunch. Throughout his meal, Mr. Park observed how Min handled the lunch rush. She orchestrated the chaos of the diner like a conductor, anticipating needs, moving with purpose, keeping multiple orders straight without missing a beat, all while unconsciously humming classical pieces under her breath. As he finished his last bite of pancake, he watched her help an elderly woman who dropped her fork, then seamlessly slide over to refill a student's coffee cup while answering a question from Ray about an order. In each movement, there was a musicality that couldn't be taught. When Min brought his check, he decided to take a chance. "That piano," he said, nodding toward the corner. "Does it work?" "More or less," Min replied, stacking his empty plates. "A few keys stick, and it hasn't been tuned in ages, but it still has some life in it." "Would you play something?" The question caught her off guard. "Just a small piece. I'd really like to hear it." Min looked around the half-empty diner, then at her watch. Her break wasn't for another hour, and there were tables to clean, coffee to brew, and a part of her that had been quiet for too long was suddenly wide awake. I can't right now," she said finally, "but maybe another time." Mr. Park nodded, leaving his usual generous tip, plus a business card tucked under his coffee cup. "Another time, then, when you're ready." Min picked up the card after he left, reading the elegant text, "Park Productions, where music finds its way home." She slipped it into her apron pocket, her fingers trembling slightly. For the rest of her shift, she felt its presence like a small flame, warm and full of possibility. The lunch rush hit Joey's Diner like a storm. The kitchen sizzled with activity, plates clattered, and the door chime barely had a chance to rest. Min moved through the chaos with her usual grace, but today felt different. The business card in her apron pocket seemed to weigh heavier with each passing hour. Her brother had called that morning with news about their father's latest medical bills. The numbers danced in her head, mocking the rhythm of her steps as she balanced plates and smiled through her worry. The diner's air conditioning was acting up again, and sweat trickled down her back as she rushed between tables. Then it happened. A simple mistake. She brought French fries instead of sweet potato fries to table 12. The customer, a man in an expensive suit who'd been talking loudly on his phone since he arrived, exploded at the error. "Can't you do anything right?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the diner's busy hum. "I specifically said sweet potato fries. What's so difficult about that? Do you even speak English?" The diner fell quiet. Min felt every eye on her, felt the heat rise in her cheeks. 5 years of customer service had taught her to handle difficult people. But today, with her father's bills weighing on her mind and exhaustion seeping into her bones, something inside her cracked. "I'll fix that right away, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely steady. But as she turned to head back to the kitchen, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Ray caught her arm as she passed the kitchen window. "Take 5, kid," he said quietly, his weathered face creased with concern. "I'll handle the fries." Min nodded, unable to speak. Her feet carried her to the old piano in the corner, the one place in the diner that had always felt like a sanctuary. She sat on the worn bench, not caring who saw her. The business card crinkled in her pocket as she shifted. Her fingers found the keys without thought. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne Op. 9 no. 2 filled the air, hesitant at first, like raindrops before a storm. The sticky keys and slightly out-of-tune notes couldn't mask the beauty of the piece. Min closed her eyes, letting muscle memory take over. She played softly at first, but as the music flowed through her, everything else faded away. The worries about money, the rude customer, the endless cycle of coffee pots and orders, all of it dissolved into the melody. Her fingers remembered every note, every subtle change in tempo, every delicate shift in emotion that she'd practiced thousands of times in another life. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds had ceased. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the piano. Min swayed slightly as she played, lost in the music she denied herself for so long. In booth 7, Mr. Park sat with his usual coffee, having arrived just minutes before the incident. He watched as the waitress he'd been observing for weeks transformed before his eyes. Gone was the careful restraint she usually showed. In its place was pure, raw talent and emotion pouring through every note. As the final notes faded away, Min opened her eyes to find the diner still silent. Then, from somewhere near the counter, someone started clapping. Others joined in, including the elderly couple by the window who came in every afternoon for coffee and pie. The man from table 12 had put his phone down, his face a mixture of embarrassment and awe. Ray stood in the kitchen doorway, sweet potato fries forgotten in his hand, grinning from ear to ear. Min felt her cheeks flush again, but this time not from humiliation. She stood quickly, smoothing her apron with trembling hands. But before she could hurry back to work, she caught Mr. Park's eye. He nodded once, a simple gesture that seemed to say everything that needed to be said. As she walked back to the kitchen, her steps felt lighter. The weight of the business card in her pocket had changed, from a burden of what if to a promise of maybe. The afternoon sun caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and somewhere in the diner, a coffee cup clinked against a saucer, bringing the world slowly back to its normal rhythm. But something had shifted, like the first key change in a piece of music, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, a new melody was about to begin. The evening after her unexpected piano performance, Min was wiping down tables when Mr. Park returned to the diner. The dinner rush had ended, leaving behind coffee-stained cups and the lingering smell of fried food. She noticed he wasn't in his usual business attire, but wearing a casual sweater that made him look more approachable. "Could we talk for a moment?" he asked, gesturing to an empty booth. Min glanced at Ray, who nodded and mouthed, "Go ahead," from behind the counter. The vinyl booth squeaked as she sat down, her hands fidgeting with her order pad out of habit. The business card he'd given her was still in her apron pocket, slightly bent from being carried around all week. "I have a proposition for you," Mr. Park began, placing his laptop bag on the table. "But first, I want you to know that I heard everything today. Not just the music, but the story behind it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes life forces us to set aside our dreams, but that doesn't mean they're gone forever." Min felt her throat tighten. She thought about her dad's medical bills piling up on their kitchen table, her brother's college textbooks that needed to be paid for, and the countless nights she'd spent wondering if she'd made the right choice. "There's a charity event coming up in 3 weeks," Mr. Park continued, pulling out some papers from his bag. "It's for a children's music education program. Our scheduled pianist had to withdraw due to a family emergency." He spread the papers on the table. Event details, program requirements, compensation information. "We need someone who can perform a 40-minute classical set. The pay is equivalent to 3 months of—" He gestured around the diner. "This." Min stared at the papers, her heart racing. 3 months, she whispered, thinking of her father's upcoming treatments. "You have the talent. That's obvious to anyone who heard you play today. But more than that, you have something rare. The ability to make people feel the music, not just hear it." He tapped the papers gently. "The question is, are you willing to take this chance?" The practical part of her mind started listing all the reasons why she couldn't: her shifts at the diner, the lack of practice time, her rusty skills. But then she remembered how it felt to play today, how the music had washed away everything else. I haven't seriously practiced in years," she admitted. "And my shifts here—" "I'll cover her shifts," came Ray's voice from behind the counter. Min turned to find him and 2 other waitresses, Lai and Aunt Wong, who wasn't really anyone's aunt, but insisted everyone call her that, standing there with determined looks on their faces. "We heard everything," Lai said, grinning. "We can split your shifts between us. You've covered for all of us at some point." Aunt Wong nodded firmly. "The piano's yours whenever you need it. After closing, before opening, whenever. I'll make sure you have food too. Can't practice on an empty stomach." Min felt tears welling up in her eyes. These people, who she saw more than her own family, who shared their lives with her over coffee pots and order tickets, were offering to help make her dream possible. "The piano here," she started, thinking of the sticky keys and out-of-tune notes. "There's a practice room at my studio," Mr. Park said. "It's yours to use whenever you want. And I know a great piano tuner who can help with this one too." He gestured to the old upright in the corner. "For your practice sessions here." Min looked around at these faces. Mr. Park with his kind eyes and gentle smile, Ray pretending to be busy with the coffee machine, but obviously listening, Lai and Aunt Wong waiting expectantly. She thought about her father, who used to sit and listen to her practice for hours when she was young, always believing in her talent. Her hand went to her apron pocket, touching the business card that had been burning a hole there all week. Sometimes life's biggest moments come disguised as simple choices. This didn't feel simple, but it did feel right. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Then stronger. "Okay. Yes, I'll do it." The smile that spread across Mr. Park's face matched the ones on her coworkers' faces. As they started discussing schedules and practice times, the old piano in the corner seemed to stand a little straighter, as if it too was ready for this new chapter to begin. The next 2 weeks became a blur of coffee cups, piano keys, and too little sleep. Min's days took on a new rhythm. She'd arrive at the diner at dawn to practice on the newly tuned piano before the breakfast crowd arrived. The morning light would stream through the windows as her fingers remembered their old patterns, stumbling at first, then growing more confident with each passing day. Between her shortened shifts, she'd rush to Mr. Park's studio, her bus ride spent studying sheet music propped on her lap. The practice room there felt like another world, pristine and professional, with a grand piano that responded to her touch like a dream. But somehow, she found herself preferring the slightly imperfect sound of the diner's old upright. It had character, like an old friend who'd been waiting patiently for her return. Late at night, after the last customer had gone and Ray had turned off the grill, she'd play until her fingers ached. Aunt Wong would leave containers of dumplings or soup on the piano, appearing and disappearing like a gentle ghost. "You're too skinny," she'd say, patting Min's shoulder. "Musicians need strength." One night, exhausted after a particularly long practice session, Min fell asleep at the piano. She woke to find someone had draped a coat over her shoulders, probably Lai, who always worked the closing shift. The clock read 2 a.m., and her fingers were stiff from the cold. But as she flexed them, working out the cramping, she couldn't help but smile. This kind of tired felt different from the exhaustion of endless coffee refills and customer demands. This tired felt like progress. The piece she'd chosen for the charity event was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It's ambitious, Mr. Park had warned, but Min knew it was the right choice. She'd first fallen in love with classical music listening to this piece with her father, back when she was just a little girl who could barely reach the piano keys. Now, as she practiced the complex runs and emotional swells, she felt like she was having a conversation with her younger self. There were moments of doubt, of course. One afternoon, her hands shaking from too much coffee and too little rest, she couldn't get through a particularly difficult passage. Frustration bubbled up, and she slammed the key cover down harder than she meant to. The sound echoed through the empty diner. Rough spot? Ray asked from behind the counter, making her jump. She hadn't realized he was there. I can't get it right, she said, running her hands through her hair. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I'm not ready. Ray walked over, wiping his hands on his apron. You know what cooking and music have in common? He asked, leaning against the piano. Timing. Sometimes you gotta let things simmer. Can't rush it. He gestured to the keys. Try it again, but slower this time, like you're teaching it to someone else. Min opened the key cover again, took a deep breath, and started the passage at half speed. Her fingers found their way, and gradually, the music began to flow. Ray stood there listening, nodding along, until she'd worked through the entire section. See? He said with a gentle smile. Sometimes you just need to slow down to speed up. The days rolled by, marked by small victories and unexpected moments of kindness. Her brother visited one afternoon, bringing their father's old metronome from home. Lai and the other waitresses covered her shifts without complaint, even during the busy weekend rushes. Regular customers who'd heard about the upcoming performance would ask for previews, and she'd oblige with short pieces during her breaks. 1 week before the event, Mr. Park sat in his usual booth, listening to her morning practice. When she finished, he simply said, You're ready. The words settled over her like a warm blanket, comfortable and reassuring. That night, as she locked up the diner, her reflection caught in the darkened window. She looked tired. Yes, but there was something else there too. A spark in her eyes that had been missing for too long. The same spark she used to see in old photographs of herself at the conservatory. Not just passion or determination, but something deeper. The quiet joy of finding her way back to herself, one note at a time. The concert hall lobby buzzed with excitement. Ladies in elegant dresses and men in sharp suits mingled, champagne glasses tinkling. Backstage, Min stood in a borrowed dark blue dress, her hands cold despite the warm evening. Through the small window in the preparation room, she could see the sun setting over the city skyline. Her brother had helped their father into his best suit and brought him to the performance. It was his first time leaving the hospital in weeks, but he'd insisted on coming. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, he'd said with that gentle smile she remembered from her childhood recitals. A quick peek through the curtain revealed something that made her heart skip. The entire morning shift from Joey's Diner sat in the audience, still in their work uniforms. Ray had closed the diner early, the first time in 15 years, so everyone could attend. Aunt Wong had brought her famous dumplings for the reception, proudly telling anyone who would listen about our Min and her beautiful playing. Mr. Park appeared beside her, looking distinguished in his tuxedo. How are you feeling? He asked quietly. Min's fingers tapped an invisible piano on her skirt. Like my heart might jump out of my chest, she admitted. There are so many people. Look at me, he said gently. When you go out there, don't think about the critics or the donors. Play for the people who believed in you when you'd stopped believing in yourself. Play for that little girl who fell in love with Rachmaninoff. The rest will take care of itself. The stage manager signaled 5 minutes. Min closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She could smell coffee and grilled cheese sandwiches. Someone had brought dinner for the diner crew, who'd come straight from their shifts. The familiar scent somehow calmed her nerves. Walking onto the stage felt like floating. The lights were bright, but not bright enough to hide the faces she knew so well. Her father in the 3rd row, tears already glistening in his eyes. Ray and the diner crew scattered throughout the audience in their familiar uniforms, looking both out of place and perfectly right. Lai giving her a thumbs up. Aunt Wang dabbing her eyes with a napkin. The grand piano waited center stage, its polished surface reflecting the stage lights like stars. As Min sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys, the hall fell silent. In that moment, she remembered something her father used to say. Music isn't just in your fingers, it's in your heart. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the hall. Min's fingers found their way through the familiar melody, each note carrying years of memories. The countless mornings practicing before the diner opened. The late nights with only the kitchen clock for company. The warmth of coffee cups brought by caring hands. The sound of her father's breathing as he slept in his hospital bed while she hummed old songs. As the music swelled, Min felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a performance, it was a thank you letter. To her father who had sacrificed everything for his children's dreams. To Ray who kept the diner's lights on late so she could practice. To Aunt Wang who fed her body and soul. To Lai who covered double shifts without complaint. To Mr. Park who saw past the coffee-stained apron to the musician underneath. The challenging passages that had once made her stumble now flowed like water. Her hands danced across the keys, drawing out emotions she hadn't known how to express in words. Joy, gratitude, hope, loss, love. Each note was a story, each phrase a memory. When she reached the final movement, Min caught a glimpse of her father. His eyes were closed, his expression peaceful, swaying slightly to the music just as he used to do during her childhood practices. In that moment, she wasn't playing in a grand concert hall. She was that little girl again, sharing the magic of music with the people she loved. The final notes resonated through the hall, hanging in the air like morning mist. For a heartbeat, there was complete silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone started clapping. The sound spread like wildfire until the entire hall was on its feet. Through tears, Min saw Ray whistling with his fingers in his mouth, Aunt Wang sobbing openly into her handkerchief, Lai jumping up and down, and her father, her wonderful, strong, tired father, standing with help from her brother, his face shining with pride. As she stood to take her bow, Min realized something. Success wasn't about returning to her old dreams. It was about finding new ones, bigger ones, that had room for all the people who had helped her along the way. 3 months after the charity performance, Joey's diner had changed in subtle but significant ways. The old piano in the corner now gleamed with a fresh polish, and a small plate on its side read, "The People's Conservatory. Lessons available." The corner around it had been transformed into a cozy music nook, with warm lighting and actual chairs replacing the wobbly stools. Min still wore her waitress apron most days, but now it had sheet music peeking out of the pockets instead of just order pads. The charity event hadn't made her famous overnight. Life rarely worked that way. But it had opened doors she'd thought were permanently closed. On Tuesday afternoons, the diner filled with the sound of piano lessons. Min's first student had been the granddaughter of one of her regular customers, a shy 12-year-old who'd been at the charity performance. Now she had 8 regular students, each paying what their families could afford. Some paid in cash, others in home-cooked meals or promises to help around the diner. "More coffee, Mrs. Chen." Min asked, topping off the cup of an elderly woman who always came to watch the lessons. The woman nodded, smiling as she watched a young boy struggle through his scales. You remind me of my piano teacher from long ago, Mrs. Chen said softly. She also believed music should be for everyone, not just those who could afford fancy lessons. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. During lesson breaks, Ray would emerge from the kitchen with plates of fries for the waiting students. Aunt Wong kept a special tin of cookies just for the nervous ones about to perform their first piece. Even the grumpiest customers found themselves softening when a child finally mastered a difficult passage, their proud grins visible through the window into the music corner. Min's father's health had improved enough for him to visit the diner once a week. He'd sit in the corner with his tea, watching his daughter move between serving customers and teaching music, his eyes bright with pride. The medical bills were still there, but the extra income from teaching helped ease the burden. More importantly, the music had brought back a light to his face that Min hadn't realized was missing. Every Sunday afternoon, the diner hosted what they called coffee and classics. The regular menu was supplemented with special desserts, and anyone could sign up to perform. Sometimes, it was Min's students showing off their progress. Other times, hidden talents emerged from unexpected places, like the quiet businessman who turned out to be a former jazz pianist, or the high school janitor with an opera-worthy voice. Mr. Park still came for his blueberry pancakes, but now he often brought friends from the music industry. Some offered Min more prestigious teaching positions or performance opportunities, but she always politely declined. I'm exactly where I need to be, she'd tell them, gesturing to the mix of coffee cups and sheet music scattered across the tables. One evening, after a particularly successful student recital, Min stayed late to practice. As her fingers moved through a gentle Chopin piece, she thought about how different this felt from her conservatory days. Back then, she'd been chasing perfection, trying to prove something. Now, the music flowed more naturally, carrying with it all the stories and lives that intersected in this humble diner. The door chimed, and she looked up to see a woman in business attire, clearly having just left her office. I'm sorry, the woman said hesitantly. I know you're closed, but I heard the music. I used to play years ago, before life got too busy. Min smiled, scooting over on the piano bench. Would you like to try? She asked. I find it's never too late to come back to something you love. As the woman sat down, hands hovering uncertainly over the keys, Min caught her reflection in the darkened window. She saw not just herself, but all the pieces of her life that had somehow fallen into perfect harmony. The waitress, the teacher, the musician, the daughter, the friend. Each role enriched the others, creating a melody uniquely her own. The diner's old piano might not have been as grand as the one she'd played at the charity event, but its music carried something special. The sound of dreams being reborn, of barriers breaking down, of a community coming together note by note. And that, Min had learned, was the most beautiful music of all.